Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this very special event that we have this evening. My name's Gary Egan. I'm the Director of the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Integrative Brain Function, and it's my absolute pleasure and delight to welcome you here to this event this evening. It's really an exciting night. We've got two outstanding luminary speakers from overseas, Christof Koch from the United States and Karlheinz Meier from Germany. And as you can see, the title of our topic tonight is Brains and Computers. So that pretty much sums up what I think we're about. The Centre of Excellence has now been running for a couple of years. It was funded back in 2014. And the key question that the Centre of Excellence is focusing on is how does the brain interact with the world? So we're particularly interested in understanding both the systems of a whole brain, the circuits through the brain, and the cellular and synaptic processes which receive sensory information, give rise to internal neural pathways, and then generate external behaviours. And this is very much in response to the world and the environment that we live in. So our Centre of Excellence is focused on these three scales of brain function, and we also have a very strong interest in using technologies and developing new technologies to integrate the very large amounts of data which are being collected by scientists at the systems, circuit and cellular level. So that is a snapshot of what the Centre of Excellence is doing. And the three key integrative brain functions that we're focusing on are understanding attention, looking at how the brain predicts its environment, so predictive coding, and then ultimately decision-making processes. And this work is being undertaken both in human subjects who are being involved in imaging experiments particularly, as well as in a number of animal models where we're able to probe the synaptic and cellular processes and explore circuits through the brain. So our research is underway across 6 universities in Australia, from Monash University, where it's headquartered, the University of Melbourne, the University of Sydney, University of New South Wales, also the University of Queensland, and the Australian National University in Canberra. We have 15 chief investigators working from those 6 universities, and we're aiming to develop a large Australian brain initiative in conjunction with other researchers, brain researchers across the country, to tackle some of the very big problems in neuroscience and understanding the brain. But that's where I'll stop, and I'll now invite our Master of Ceremony for this evening, Bernie Hobbs, to come up to the lectern. Thank you, Bernie.
Thanks, Gary. And I am not a luminary from neuroscience or from any other field of brain science. I'm delighted to be here tonight. I'm a humble reporter from what's left of the ABC Science Unit, and it's great to be here with you. And how fantastic to look out and see such a diverse-looking crowd, and to know that if you just call something brains and computers, you can pull a sellout crowd on a Monday night in Melbourne. So I'm just going to bear that in mind for the next event that I'm involved in. Tonight, as Gary said, we are going to hear from 2 world leaders in neuroscience, but we're also about making sure that you're getting a chance to ask questions of these leaders. This is a public event. It's not a lecture in science. It is, you'll be hearing from cutting-edge researchers about where we're at with neuroscience and computing. And you can't be alive today and even half interested in what's happening in your world without knowing that great strides have been made in understanding bits about how the brain works. You would have seen things on the news about people being able to control a prosthetic with, thinking, training themselves to think in a particular way. Very early days with that sort of thing at this stage. People using functional MRI and other technologies to be able to kind of read what people are thinking in very limited ways. So there are little advances being made on that sort of scale. We've got people like Elon Musk has just announced that he's got a startup trying to get rid of any swiping, wiping or series between us and our technology, so we can just fully and seamlessly integrate with technology. So there's a whole lot of action going on at those levels in both computing and neuroscience, but when you speak to the people who are involved, it seems that we know an extraordinary amount about individual neurons and very small collections of neurons. We've totally nailed and when I say we, I'm just using that collective license of being near the luminaries, nailed the workings of a single neuron or a couple of neurons together, got a very good idea of how the brain as a whole works, like as this big organ or looks, or which bits are responsible. It's just that bit in between the neurons and the whole brain that we're struggling to get our heads around. How does the brain work, and how does consciousness arise from these tens of billions of connections that we understand at the individual level? So not sure that we'll be addressing that tonight, totally resolving how the brain works tonight, but we'll be having a very fine look at what the strategies are that are being taken. For me, I love the idea that the human brain has developed the beginnings of its own artificial brain, computers, and as those computers are developing, we're needing to rely more on them to help us try and understand our brain. So there's that intimate link there already, but just the idea that the two are advancing in parallels is pretty intriguing. Now, our two leaders who we're going to be hearing from tonight both head up projects within enormous collaborative efforts to help us try and understand the brain a bit better. We'll hear from each of them for 20 minutes and then it's over to you for questions. Don't waste your time with the questions. Please get your hands up straight away because it's a very limited bit of time. Our first speaker is Professor Christof Koch, who has been involved in understanding or working towards an understanding of consciousness for decades. I'm sure he wouldn't mind me saying decades. He's what was the pioneer with his collaborator Francis Crick of the scientific approach to consciousness, to understanding consciousness, and he now he's the Chief Scientific Officer at the Allen Institute for Brain Science in the US, an open science collaborative bit of work where they're looking at trying to understand the consciousness in the mouse brain and the human brain. I'm sure he'll very gladly show his keychain model of, I hope I haven't given anything away there, of the actual mouse brain, which may feature in his conversation, I'm not sure. Christof said to me before, his feelings about how complex the brain is that we will have true artificial intelligence before we understand how the brain works. So that's from someone who's at the cutting edge of it. Join me in welcoming our first speaker this evening from the Allen Institute for Brain Science in Seattle. You can guess which one it is when I said Seattle, just looking at the outfits over there. Join me in welcoming our first speaker, Professor Christof Koch.
You can also see I'm from the Pacific Northwest. I don't have a tie. In fact, I don't owe a tie. We will soon have the first slide.
On his way. Yes, technology we've nailed. It's just the brain that we're having some problems with.
All right, so let me start talking. So I'm at an institute that's a sort of a new creation. We're testing a new sociological model of neuroscience. So most of neuroscience, there are 60,000 neuroscientists operating in 10,000 labs worldwide, including many here in Australia. And they're all sort of doing their own thing in a vast variety of different animal species, or including humans, using different techniques at different developmental time points. What we're trying to do, we are 300 people now. We were started in 2003, and we are somewhere between university and a biotech startup. So we have techniques that we borrow from industry, like program management, so-called SMART goals. You don't need to know what that are. They're tools to manage large number of people and make sure they align and they deliver what they said they would deliver. And other techniques like that, but we're all driven by basic neuroscience. Our goal is to accelerate neuroscience. We don't make any profit. Our budget's roughly 100 million a year. 90% of that comes from one donor, Paul Allen. So Paul Allen, as you may know, started together with Bill Gates' Microsoft, and He is very curious about the world, particularly the world of science. So he's endowed a number of institutes, particularly he's endowed us. And we are now, when I left university 6 years ago to lead this effort. It's a 10-year effort that focuses on understanding questions in two particular species, the mouse and the human brain. Now, this is the mouse. So this is a model of the mouse brain here. It's less than a sugar cube. And particularly, we are focused on one aspect of the mouse brain that's typical for the mouse, but also for all other mammals, including humans, namely the neocortex. So the neocortex, you must have seen brains. They're sort of like a cauliflower, and the outermost shell of that cauliflower is cortex. In fact, one cortex, we have two, left and right, is pretty much the size of half of this towel, and it's pretty much the same width. So it's like, or you can also think of it as a pizza, like 12-inch pizza, 2 to 3 millimeter thick. And then, of course, it's highly convolved, and you have one of them on the left and one of them on the right half of the brain. So this is the institute that we also have a new building. This is the institute that Paul Allen built for us last year. It's just next to the Amazon headquarters, right? So Amazon is just next to us. So it's a beautiful lab, a beautiful building dedicated to neuroscience. And so here you see Paul and Bill Gates a while ago, and this is, if you're interested, he's written about his interest. So what we are about big science, so we focus on a few large projects. Rather than having many different neuroscientists that all do their own thing, we are large teams. We are trying to work very closely together, which is very difficult because, as you may have heard, sort of getting scientists, particularly academics, to align on anything is worse than herding cats, which is not easy. And also we practice very much open science. So I think one problem with science is that of course it's almost entirely funded by the public, but most of the actual data and the papers are behind various paywalls. Either they remain unpublished, or they remain in some laboratory notebook, or they remain on the website or on the tape of individual labs, and the papers aren't accessible. So we do this open policy from the get-go since 14 years. So everything we do, once it passes quality control, is put outside. Right now, you can go to brain-map.org, and you can download all the data I'm going to talk about. It's freely available. You don't have to have a login. Anybody on the planet can mine it. And if you make a great discovery and have a startup and become very rich, good luck, and I hope you'll thank us. So as I said, we are studying these two brains, the human brain and the mouse brain. The human brain is roughly 1,000 times bigger in terms of size of that cortical sheet, in terms of the numbers of neurons, in terms of weight. It's very similar. Once you remove the scale bar, so on one of these displays, you see a display of neocortex, this piece of tissue. This sheet-like tissue. Each spot that you can see here is actually a little cell. And once you remove the scale bar, so the width of the human cortex is 3 times thicker than the width of a mouse cortex. But of course, other animals like whales and elephants have even bigger cortices or bigger brains than we do. So we are one among many other species that have this neocortex. Now, of course, this neocortex, as I said, is made out of cells. We discovered roughly 180 years ago that cells is a basic unit of biology, right? So any creature is made out of one or more cells, and cells can beget other cells, right? And so that's also, and then we realized, well, there's not just cells, there are brain cells, and there are liver cells, and there are heart cells, and they all differ. And so here you can see some brain cells. So if you zoom, if you want, on that previous picture, if you zoom into that, then and you use special techniques, staining techniques, you can see these are individual nerve cells. So these are nerve cells, neurons. They happen to be pyramidal cells. And here you can see, using staining, these are the input zones. So you have these very thin structures, and they sort of they are waiting for other neurons to contact them. These are called the dendrites, and then all their results sort of electrically are collected at the cell body, and then there's an electrical process that decides whether or not to send out an action potential that's put on the output wire, so-called axon, and then relayed through other parts of the brain. One of them, incidentally, is a human neuron, and the other one is a mouse neuron. Once again, they look very similar once we remove the scale bar. The basic stuff is all the same. Now these are so-called pyramidal cells, layer 5 pyramidal cells. It turns out they aren't just brain cells. Brain cells here isn't just like a brain cell there. It turns out there are many different types of brain cells. And it's really critical important, we believe, and we have evidence to suggest this, that if we want to understand any brain disease, it's not just, very often, it's not just a disease of all cells, but it's a disease that only affects particular types of neurons. So think we have the following problem in brain science. We have a Lego set, remember Legos? Lego set of 100 billion bricks. And we want to know how many types of bricks there are because we need to understand the rules by which these bricks are fit together to give rise to the brain. And we don't know those. We don't know how many types there are precisely, and we don't know what characterizes each type. So one project we do that I want to talk about today is just to essentially do something like this. So for chemistry, we discovered 130 years ago, science, that all of the extant chemical elements, 92, the natural elements, fall into a particular organizational scheme called the periodic table. The question, can we figure out all the different types of neurons, of nerve cells, and also fit them into some scheme? Presumably not a simple scheme as a periodic table that ultimately arises out of quantum mechanics, but something much more complicated. But can we do that? So we classify neurons in very high throughput pipelines using a variety of tools. Here, for instance, you have one particular type of neurons. It shows you in 3D. This is an inhibitory neuron. So if it's active, it suppresses the activity of neurons it talks to. The dendrites are those little reds, the red little fibers. And its output wire doesn't just go to 1 or 2 or 3 neurons like a typical transistor, transistor gate on a CPU does in your laptops or your cell phones, but it has all these green wires. So its output goes to lots and lots of different neurons. You can see the top of that is limited by the top of cortex. So we classify neurons using automatic tools, computer-assisted tools using their shape. Then we also classified neurons using the different genes that are expressed in each neuron. So each neuron has 8 or 10,000 genes, but they're differentially expressed. So one neuron has 15 particular genes that are highly expressed in one and very low expressed in others. So we're using modern tools of supervised or unsupervised machine learning to classify them. So here we can classify all cells in the brain. First of all, do they fall into neurons versus non-neuronal types like astrocytes or glia cells or vascular cells? And then we can distinguish excitatory, inhibitory. And so right now we can distinguish in each brain area between 50 and 100 different types of neurons. So altogether, that seems to suggest that you can sort of draw these ontology trees. There might be 1,000 different types of neurons. So this is why the neurons, you must have heard this, people often say a tiny, this 1 by 1 by 1 millimeter piece of, this is roughly 1 by 1 by 1 millimeter. If this is cortex, this is by far the most complex piece of highly organized matter in the universe, bar none. By far the most complex. Partly because it has very large number of highly heterogeneous elements, these 1,000 or more different cell types, that are connected in these very complicated ways, and their connections are plastic, the synapses. That's why we can learn lifelong. And this piece of highly excitable matter also exudes consciousness, of course. And the big question is that we and others are trying to answer, how that specifically that experience, that consciousness arises out of that piece of matter. And then we also classify the neuron using the electrical behavior. So here what you see, you can go with a little microelectrode, a wire inside a cell, and you can inject current, you can sort of excite them, electrical current, and then you can hear them, they generate these pulses. And using sophisticated computer models, you can reproduce this. So you begin to understand something. So you can classify neurons using their shapes. You can classify the neurons using their genes that are expressed, so-called single-cell mRNA-seq transcriptomics. And you can classify neurons using the electrical behavior. And you can also do this in human. So in human, you rarely have access to living neurons. Of course, you have access to a living brain using brains in a brain scanner, but there you're looking at the brain from outside, and you have a very crude look. It's like sort of blurring your eyes and taking your glasses off, and you can see bits and pieces of the brain where the blood flow changes. But ultimately, the atoms of perception, the atoms of memory and consciousness are individual neurons. And so we need access to neurons, live neurons. So the vast majority of what we know about the human brain at the cellular level is from dead brain, post-mortem. But there are rare cases in neurosurgery. So typically in a neurosurgical practice, if it's large, once every couple of weeks or so, you'll have access. Let's say the surgeon has to remove a tumor or has to remove epileptic foci. In order to get to that foci, the tumor, he has to drill through an overlying piece of sort of tunnel through the overlying cortex. And then we have a special team working with variety of clinics in Seattle area. We take that, we put it in a special prep, we drive it to our labs, and now we can record just like we can do in a mouse, but now we can record from a piece of brain that can be as, sometimes it's as big as my little pinky, sometimes it can be as big as this. We cut it in slices. Now this piece of brain, 20 minutes earlier, was part of somebody's functioning brain and might contain the memory of the first kiss, but because of the neurosurgery, it had to be removed. And rather than it being discarded as medical waste, which what happens now, we can actually study it. And we see, it behaves in some ways very similar to the cells you find in monkeys and in mice. Now, lastly, we also want to classify neurons by the different function. So we also want to see what happens. We want to understand what happens when a person or an animal is actually thinking or making a decision or looking at something. Now, that we can't do in humans at the level of individual neurons. We can do it in humans at this crude time scale in fMRI, in brain scanning, but not at the cellular level. So what we've built over the last 5 years is sort of a brain observatory where so here you can see a mouse running on a disk. It's running, and it's been taught to, for example, stop and to get a water reward at particular type of oriented stimuli. So here it's been trained to run past horizontal bars, and I think this one, it's supposed to, there it stops when it sees a vertical bar. And so now we can either see through the skull, or we have a team of 6 neurosurgeons that operate a window into the skull. So now we can look at the brain of the animal we can watch the brain of the animal as it's making a decision. For example, should I or should I not run past that particular stimuli? So we can observe it, the thoughts in action. So here you can see this using the oneness of transgenic. So we have these transgenic animals. We're using the oneness, the miracle of transgenic technology. We can convert these electrical pulses into flashes of light. And you see that here in the middle. So this is at a high magnified scale where we have now 30,000 of these. So each one of these little spheres is a little neuron that you see switching in real time as the animal is running on the left. It's running on the training wheel watching the movie Touch of Evil. It's an Orson Welles. Here we track its eyes, we track lots of its parameters. We track its body, we track all sorts of things. All of that data, by the way, is made available. So you can download all that data if you want to analyze it. And so this allows us now to study particular type of neurons, that we've identified by their morphology or by the gene they express, so that we can begin to say, that's interesting. Cell type 22, a layer 5 Martinotti cell, only responds in this way to visual stimuli. And another layer 6 type of neuron doesn't respond here, but responds to something different, so that we can link their morphology, their electrical behavior in a dish, the genes they express ultimately with cognition. And then also using other techniques, we can turn, using a technique called optogenetic, we could turn those neurons on and off. So there are wonderful techniques now using beams of different color light in an animal brain so far that we can turn neurons on or off, and we can observe the effect of behavior. And thereby, we hope to ultimately take all of this knowledge and then ultimately, not only will it help us understand the brain, but also help develop therapies like you may have seen over the last weeks. There was another case of a patient having actually array deployed in their visual cortex to try to, in this case, help quadriplegic move. And so this is our team, and with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Christof. That was absolutely spectacular. I was impressed to start with the neurosurgeons who can operate on a tiny window on a mouse brain. That's pretty spectacular. But then you totally blew me away with the mouse watching the movie. Can I just ask, why did you choose A Touch of Evil?
I can tell you exactly why. Because it has a very long... How many of you have seen it? Touch of Evil? It's a great Orson Welles movie, and it's narco-terrorism. It plays in 1950 in Texas at the border with Mexico. We chose it because there's a very long, continuous point of view.
Okay.
And that's what we wanted. Not constant camera cuts, but a continuous point of view, which sort of resembles more what a mouse would see, because it doesn't move its eyes a lot.
So it wasn't just a desire to.
It wasn't the artistic.
No,
I don't think mice.
Okay, now it's about time for me to hand over to our second speaker. Now, one thing I didn't mention about Christof was that he actually started out as a physicist, and it turns out that there's no shortage of leaders in neuroscience research who started out as physicists. Gary Egan also started out as a physicist, and our next speaker, Karlheinz Meier, also started out as a physicist. In fact, he only got Jack of Physics in 2000, I think. Around about then. Got a bit bored with particle physics, all those bosons and what have you, and left CERN and took up neuroscience because, need a challenge. So Karlheinz is part of the European Human Brain Project, and he was one of the co-founders of the project, and he's a co-director at the University of Heidelberg, vice chair of the Human Brain Project. Whereas Christof is interested, and his team is interested in studying and trying to understand how consciousness arises from the physicality of all those neural networks. Karlheinz is looking at information processing within the brain, trying to understand how neural networks can process information, and then trying to build computers and building computers and that imitate that style of processing. So making a fake brain out of silicon, I presume. Something like that?
Something like that.
I didn't just give your talk away.
No, it was pretty much what I wanted to say.
Okay. So as well as physicists, he's also German. I do not want you to get the idea that only Germans and physicists are leading neuroscience. We've just got a little bit of a run on them today. Okay, so join me in welcoming Professor Karlheinz Meier.
Thank you for the nice words. Good evening. It's really impressive to see this huge crowd here. I'm impressed by the interest in science, and I always find science very rewarding, and I hope you feel the same. This is why you are here. So about 50 years ago, it was a profession to be a computer. You could be a computer, and you could be paid for being a computer. This is a company somewhere in the US, I think, and they hired, about 100, I think mostly women, that actually did calculations like this one here. And of course you can all do that. If I would ask any of you here to do that calculation, you could easily do that with your own brain. You could use your brain, and it would take you something like tens of seconds, and your brain consumes a power. Now power is a difficult concept. It's energy per time. And so the power your brain consumes is about 20 watts, like one of these old-fashioned light bulbs. If you want to calculate energy from power, you would have to multiply with the time. Now, of course, we don't do this anymore, but we all have these machines in our pocket, and there are apps on that. And there is one which is called the Pocket Calculator, or the Calculator app. And if you run that, you get the result easily. It's 90,700,357. And the amazing thing is, if you look to this machine, the cell phone, it consumes a little bit less than the brain, not much. It's like 5 watts. And the incredible thing, it performs tens of billions of computations per second for basically the same power. Now, we said energy is power multiplied by time. It means the cell phone is incredibly efficient. It's 1 billion times more efficient than the brain. So the brain is a very, very bad computer. And to build a system that mimics the brain for computing seems to be a totally stupid idea. Why would you possibly do that? Okay? Because it's such a bad calculator. Now, of course, you know that this is not all. You can do other things with your brain. And I have another experiment I want to do with you. It will only last 200 milliseconds. Okay? So please look to the screen. Okay, have you seen that? What was it? It was a cat. It was a blue cat, and it had wings. And you know, there are no blue cats. There are no cats with wings, and there are no blue cats with wings. And you have never seen that before, but you immediately recognized it. You formed an opinion. You said, that's crazy, stupid, silly, funny, whatever. And it took you like 200 milliseconds. So you can recognize patterns and put them into a perspective in an incredibly short time frame. And your cell phone, at least at the moment still, has problem in doing that. But the brain can do actually more. And it can not only analyze static images, it can process things that progress in time. This is a famous European, football player, Xherdan Shaqiri. This is the Euro contest last year, 2016, and he's doing this amazing gymnastics here. And of course, this is a static image, but in reality, of course, this is a thing that happens in time. This guy observes the football, he observes it with his eyes, he makes a prediction on where the ball will be in a couple of milliseconds, and then he controls the action of his feet. And what he does is really incredible. Look at this. This is the original movie.
Steiner's come away to the left wing, the right wing back. The right back, actually, in this formation. Seferovic with the touch, looking for Dario. Shaqiri!
That was quite impressive, okay? Absolutely amazing. And this guy, he probably consumes in total for his body a bit more than 100 watts. In particular, he has to move the ball with this incredible speed. And that is quite expensive. But this little brain up there consumes the same 20 watts, and it acts there for a couple of seconds. So we can do time analysis, we can make predictions, and control our bodies on a time frame of 200 milliseconds. And it would be a game changer for computing if we could do that with an artificial system. Unfortunately, it's not that easy. And the reason you see here. Okay, so here are 4 football players. They look a bit like Shaqiri, but they can't do the same job. Okay, although they definitely, if you look at them, they would like to, more than anything else. But they can't. And the problem is that they have to go through a phase which we call development and learning. These are brains recorded by an MRI method. And what we see here by the color code is the fraction of gray matter volume, how it develops from the age of 5, that's these guys which you just saw, and Shaqiri, who's probably like 20 or a bit more. Okay? And you see something changes. Gray matter disappears as a relative fraction in the brain. And does it mean that people age? Well, in some sense, yes. But what really happens is that gray matter is replaced by white matter, which is the wiring in the brain. So the brain rewires, and it builds an internal model of the world, so that at the end, people like Shaqiri can do these amazing feats of controlling the ball with this precision. So it's a long and tedious learning process. Now, people try to mimic that for a long time. And there are what we call artificial neural networks. And now there are so-called deep neural networks. And this is a great success. Okay? And I would say it's a tiny little bit of biology that we use for computing. Just a tiny little bit of biology. Just the fact that there are neurons, there are connections, and there are layers. And so what we do in these networks is that we provide a certain input pattern, like, for example, this image of a cat. Then there is some processing done in all these hidden layers. And at the end, there are certain neurons that fire if a dog, a mouse, a tree, or a car is presented to the input. And if it's a cat, the output neuron for a cat lights up. And this kind of networks, these neural networks, have been an enormous success. And you all know this incredible thing that happened last year was not only the football European Championship, but it was also that a computer was beating the world champion in Go, which is an incredible achievement because Go is far more complicated than chess. And what kind of a computer was that? It was actually a neural network, like the one I just showed you. So it had a little bit of biology in there. But there is one thing we often tend to forget. This thing was done by Google, by AlphaGo is the project name, and Google developed this really amazing computing system there. And what they did is incredible. This machine played 100, actually more, than 100 million training games against itself to learn how Go works. This is a huge success because this is, in a way, a superhuman intelligence. This thing is better than all of us in this room and basically better than every Go player in the world. But clearly there's a problem. If you and me want to play Go and we want to learn it, which is difficult, probably 100 games are enough. Certainly not 100 million. If you would play one game a day, it would take us 300,000 years to do this. Okay? So this cannot be biology. This is a great success, but it cannot be biology. And there are some things which are kind of ignored in current neural networks. There is more into neurons than just adding up information. In particular, they have a time structure. And just to illustrate that, I show you this amazing movie. This is a larvae of a zebrafish. It's transparent, and the neurons can be marked to see that actually neurons do something which Christof has just shown very nicely. They fire. They produce so-called action potentials. And information processing is taking place in those networks by producing these spikes and communicating between those neurons through axons and dendrites. So the whole aspect of time structure, of firing, communicating by time, is something that is currently fully ignored by artificial neural networks. Now, there are groups like in the Human Brain Project, for example, Henry Markram. He takes biophysical knowledge, like the one, for example, acquired by Christof and other groups in the world, and he puts it into a computer model. And he says, well, let's try to run this kind of firing, spiking neural network in a computer simulation. And this is what it looks like. The colors represent the voltage between the inside and the outside of the cell. And you may say, well, that looks similar. Okay, it's also firing. It has some kind of interesting statistics. It can be analyzed and compare it to biology. So let's go ahead and simulate the brain. There is a problem to that. And these are the meters that measure the voltage and the current that's flowing through a computer like that. You see there are thousands of amperes and 400 volts. And you all know how to calculate power from that. Okay, I hope you know. You multiply the voltage by the current. And if you do it here, you get 18 megawatts. Okay? You can go ahead and think hypothetically, if I want to simulate the human brain that way, which is 20 watts in biology, I need 1,000 gigawatts. That's easy to calculate from the numbers I have in this simulation. I just looked it up. Australia produces an electrical power, energy per time, 2013, of 62 gigawatts. So you need 15 times all the electrical power of Australia to simulate the human brain. But that's not all. There is something which is really worse. The simulation runs 1,000 times slower than biology. And you remember, it takes years to learn. So that means 1,000 times 1,000 years, you have to use 15 times all the electrical power of Australia, put it into one computer, and simulate the brain. And clearly that is completely silly. It's completely out of reach. It's a very useful thing to study smaller systems, but if you want to study by artificial systems how brains work, and may you also explain brain-like computing, we probably have to find another way. And so rather than putting brains on a computer, which I just showed, maybe we should build computers like brains. And I hope you understand that it's a completely different approach. We don't simulate, but we rebuild, we copy. We call this neuromorphic computing. And there are these chips which look kind of similar, but they are fundamentally different. So how do we do neuromorphic computing? Very short. Don't have much time left. There are basically 3 different approaches. And there is one important word here in all these 3 approaches. It's millions. Okay? So what you do to build these brain-like systems, you build the same thing many, many times. Like the brain is made of many, many neurons and connections, you say, well, I use computational elements, and I just build very many of them to make the computer like more brain-like. So there are the 3 projects. Spinnaker, run by Steve Ferber, the inventor of the ARM processor, the one that have you in your cell phone. And he just says, I will take millions of telephone processors. You have 10 of them in your cell phone, and he just uses millions of them. There is the True North project at IBM in the US, Almaden. They use millions of special digital circuits. There's our approach in Heidelberg, which is called brain scales. We use millions of analog physical circuits, which is kind of pretty much to what the real brain does. Now, why would you do that? There are two reasons. One is we model neural circuits to help advance brain science, to understand better how the brain works, in particular the learning in the brain, the learning and the self-organization. But there's a second reason, is applying brain-like principles to what we call cognitive computing. And the reasons, from what I said before, should be clear. It's to achieve energy efficiency, speed, robustness is more difficult to explain, and most importantly, the ability to learn. So very shortly, what kind of experiments are we doing? We can do the experiments that people do in machine learning, in deep learning, what everybody does. We can run deep networks on neuromorphic machines by external supervision, by training from the outside. That is nothing special. It's just what people do in machine learning today. It's just more energy efficient, and the learning is faster, which is a big advantage, but not really revolutionary. More interesting are experiments where you really do biological-inspired self-learning intrinsically in the circuit. This is an example of a biological system. This is an owl, a barn owl, and although it has very significant eyes, it also has ears. And in the dark barn, it can locate sound sources by measuring the timing difference between the left and the right ear. If the mouse is over there, this signal arrives here before it arrives on this ear. And the bird can measure the time differences. We build circuits that do exactly the same. And of course, they have to learn to do this localization. And you can do that with mechanisms that we take from biology. Maybe most exciting are things like this here. We know that the brain is not a deterministic device. It's a stochastic device. Look at this funny animal here. If you look at it, you are kind of not so sure whether it's a rabbit or a dog. And you switch between these two solutions of being a rabbit or a dog. And it tells you that the brain is doing some, we call that stochastic sampling. It has learned distributions of images, and this is a special case where the brain isn't so sure. Is the probability higher to be a rabbit or higher to be a dog? And here it has been tuned that it is about 50-50. And that's very interesting. It means we store not discrete information, but probably distributions of information. And this is an experiment running on a neuromorphic system where the system has learned to read numbers. And this is what it kind of remembers. It's dreaming of those numbers, and it's taking samples from a stochastic distribution. So stochastic computing is something you can do very nicely on neuromorphic systems. Let me shortly, before I close, make a comment on what are the advantages. We talked about energy. Where do you get your energy from? You eat bananas, of course. And a banana is 120 kilocalories, 500,000 joule, by the way. So if you eat one banana per hour, it will keep you going, okay? We said Shaqiri probably uses 120 watts or 100 watts to play football. So if Shaqiri eats one banana per hour, he would be fine. It would not be good for your health on the long term, but I mean, at least energy-wise, that's fine. That's 0.2 horsepower. So what about computing? Now you have to say, I mean, what do you need energy for? And here we say, well, let's see, how much energy do we need for a transmission of information across the synaptic gap? Okay. In our own brain, that's really difficult to read now. There are lots of zeros here. There are actually 14 zeros. So it's very little energy. Okay. If you run on a supercomputer, like the Markram simulation, it's more like 1 joule. If you simplify the model, it may be like 0.001 joule. You see, there's a huge gap, and this is why the simulations on supercomputers are so expensive. There's this enormous difference between biology and simulations. The neuromorphic systems are kind of in between. They are still worse than a biological brain, but they are an improvement of at least a factor 1 million in terms of energy consumption, which is quite impressive. Now, the other thing, and I think it's more important, is the time needed for a day. Now, that sounds strange. A day is a day. How can you need different times for a day? Well, if you simulate a biological day on a network, on a conventional computer, on a supercomputer, I said it's a factor 1,000 slower, so a day takes you 1,000 days, or 3 years, which you can do, but it's kind of awkward. Our brain, of course, a day is a day. That's real time. That's how we define our time. The neuromorphic systems can be real-time, but we also build systems that are accelerated, where we compress a day to 10 seconds, and by that are able to study, in particular, learning and development. Final slide, very complicated one. There could be, and I'm sure it will come, an era of neuromorphic computing, and the actual things that you do with neuromorphic computers is, I call that cognitive computing. And we hear a lot about neuroscience here, but I think the applications are really outside neuroscience. There are some examples here. Understanding data, business data, for example, finances, market analysis, sales, communication, IT security. Entertainment is always very important. Intelligent games, video understanding, automotive, more local autonomy in cars, not so much controlled by outside computers and other vehicles. Robotics, again, make the robotics intelligence local, not relying on external networks. The Internet of Things, again, there are these things. You have light bulbs and sensors everywhere. Should they really transmit all the data they produce? There are many reasons to say no. There are ethical reasons, there are political reasons, there are also technical reasons, because the data traffic would be enormous. Wouldn't it be great if a sensor is intelligent and only tells you, well, I probably have a problem, and only tells you that one single bit very rarely if there is a problem, and not just transmits data all the time, which will never be used. Finally, medical and science data understanding, brain imaging analysis, for example, looking for cells, cancer cells in microscopic images, and astrophysics, many other science analysis applications. That's where I see the application of neuromorphic or brain-like computing. So that's my contribution. Thank you.
Very well. So now it's over to you, and we've got two roving mics, so please shoot your hands up and we'll get a microphone to you. And we also have a Twitter handle if you want to tweet in your questions. And the Twitter handle is #BrainComp, so just use that if you're a bit shy. But I have to say it's better for everyone if you can ask your questions out loud. That would be great. I also just want to clarify, it's not just a dog or a rabbit. I thought that was a fledgling albatross.
Oh, really?
So I'm not sure if anyone else saw the albatross.
So you're really special then.
Yeah, I think, we need a little bit further study on that one. So do we have a question ready to go there? Yeah? Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. When I was 18, I also started off studying physics, so I'm in very good company here. What I want to know is, if I were 18 now and very excited about neuroscience, what should I do? What subjects should I study? Where should I study?
Do an undergraduate degree in physics and then go into neuroscience.
Yes.
There is also, often you are maybe more inclined to life science or more inclined to the technical areas. And depending on that, I fully agree with Christof, of course, always do an undergraduate in physics. That's the basis for everything. But then, of course, after that, you may move more to computer science and electric engineering, or more to wet lab science of biology. So there are lots of options, and I think it's a very, very, very promising field, because it's a huge unsolved scientific question, and it's also very close to very, very important applications. So if you ever want to be a billionaire, I guess this is the thing to do.
But in particular now there's this developing neurotech, right? So there's now more and more applications, and so there's now more and more industrial application where after you do your PhD, it used to be traditionally that the only job market for neuroscientists used to be academia, but now more there are startups operating in this space.
So all those unemployed neuroscientists come and see Christof after this evening's section. We also have a question from Twitter, which has got in straight away. If we can just get microphones to people, that would be great. Do you see ideas from neuromorphic AI feeding back into your research?
You mean into brain research?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. As I said, there are these two directions of using neuromorphic computing to help brain research and to go away from brain research and to do more generic computing. And feeding back to brain research, I think, is a very important aspect of it, in particular when it comes to understanding all the processes that describe the time development, the learning, and the plasticity of the brain. Because to simulate that is very hard for the time and energy reasons I indicated. And these machines, if they contain enough knowledge of the brain, will probably give you some non-trivial insights. I'm very convinced that this is a useful thing to do.
Thank you. And we have the microphone over here somewhere. Thank you.
I have to ask this question. I've heard a lot about autonomous vehicles, but has anyone tried to make an autonomous bicycle that can balance itself as it cycles along?
It's from a control point of view, it's a much more difficult problem than controlling an automotive, doing autonomous vehicles.
Although I must say balancing problems have been solved by neuromorphic system. There is our own group, we built what's called in the Human Brain Project, a pencil balancer, which is not so difficult. You just have a pencil on some kind of a support, and then you balance that by a spike-based neuromorphic system. That's a paper.
Not a very efficient way of getting from A to B, but certainly a great exercise in balance. Yes? Oh, sorry, we're not hearing that just yet. On this microphone? Yep.
Christof, I think you used an expression, atoms of memory and consciousness. And
neurons are the atoms.
Neurons of memory and consciousness. I wondered if you could just say a little bit more about that.
Well, that ultimately turns out to understand things like our behavior and where our memory comes from. If you remember, the last time you saw somebody, there's a very distinct crisp memory. We now know that depends on neurons interacting at particular places called synapses. And so the unit that we need to understand things like memory and perception and pain and emotions in health and in sickness is at the neuronal level and the level of where they connect, rather than the level of large brain area. So that's what I mean by that. All the evidence points to the fact that it's the electrical activity, so it's certainly empirically, we know it's the electrical activity associated with large networks of neurons firing that seems to cause our conscious experience of anything. We also know this experimentally because in a neurosurgical context, I can go into a human brain, and sometimes this is necessary, and I can put a little current into the human brain using an intracranial electrode, and the patient, depending on where you do it, the patient will see something or will hear something or will recall a particular memory. So there's good evidence to suggest it's specific type of electric activity in particular parts of the brain that give rise to conscious experience.
We have a question, if you can just, yep, thank you.
Yeah, so the video of the electrical signals look pretty cool, but it looks kind of random. So do we have any leading theories on how brain cells fire in patterns? And so more concretely, a lot of people say creativity is about connecting the two dots or connecting two neurons and forming one synapse. If we just randomly jolt and send in electrical signals to a brain, would a person feel creative?
No, so we know what happens in development. So early on, there's so-called an exuberance of neurons and neural connection. And then over the first couple of years of life, there's a lot of paring back. Because as the person learns, as the infant goes around, stumbles, falls down, plays with his fingers, try to look at the world, the brain is actively wiring. And we are beginning to understand some of the wiring rules. But it's not at all random. If it's random, it wouldn't work at all. We know this because people try to grow artificial neural networks, and if you don't give them these learning rules, they don't really amount to anything. If they want to, for example, learn how to balance a pole, you need specific type of learning rules that connect the activity in particular types of neurons together.
It's also a question how information is coded by spikes. That's a very interesting aspect of research. One of the most obvious things to code is just by the rate. So you have a sensor, for example, there's a lot of signal, a lot of light, then the rate goes up, otherwise the rate goes down. So that's the most straightforward coding, but it's not very efficient, of course. If you look to networks that actually do useful things, you see that a lot of the information is coded by correlation between spikes, which appear to be random from the outside, but which carry information just by the relative time difference, which is not so easy to detect in a biological system. If you do controlled experiment, then you can really find out that correlations play a very important role.
So not random, and a jolt won't make you creative. Don't try it at home.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
I'm interested in the proposition that any sufficiently complex system will become conscious. And this has been said many times before, but yet aren't we seeing perhaps now that computers are becoming more and more intelligent, but not necessarily conscious? Do you, for example, the computer that plays Go is perhaps more intelligent than us, but not necessarily conscious?
Yes. So
do you believe in that proposition that if we build a system that's sufficiently complex?
I think we've got an answer coming.
I think I've written I've written a book and written lots of papers about the fact, yes, it's not just it's nothing to do with behavior. So what we're now seeing, as you point out, for the first time in the history of humanity, we're seeing consciousness and intelligence being dissociated. Until now, when you wanted a job done, to balance your taxes, to fight a war, to dig a trench, you employed a person, and that person automatically had conscious experiences. Now we're seeing whether they're machines and software and hardware, that we can get more intelligent behavior, narrowly defined, but more and more powerful, like an autonomous car, in playing Go, in doing taxes, without any consciousness. So yes, in machines it can certainly be dissociated. So consciousness is not about a particular behavior. It's about the complexity of the intrinsic circuitry. There's a formal theory called Integrated Information Theory by Giulio Tononi that makes exactly that point. It is particular type of complex system. So the theory says we live in a universe where a particular type of intrinsically complex system have both an exterior aspect that we can observe, as well as an interior aspect that only the system itself can observe, which is what it feels like something to be that system. And it cannot be simulated. It actually has to come out of the physics of the system. So it says consciousness is something physical, and it has to do with the way the system is built.
Okay, I can guarantee there was at least 20 watts of power going into that answer. The heat, I can feel it. Yes, up here.
Hi, hello. I think I have a question to Mr. Meier. On your presentation, I kind of missed something. There was this picture of a nice bird, right? And there's this circuit which you build, and then you kind of learn from it and use neuromorphic computing for it. But when you transition to like general kind of purposes, right? Like for economics and robotics, how do you actually transition the information from brains of the people who are working on this, on current, knowledge, to machine? How do you build these circuits on, on other fields?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean,
So
it's
Not least of all because she saw a bird as well, but anyway, you go ahead.
So what you refer to is how you transfer circuits that you find in biology to more generic computing tasks. And I mean, what we find is that there are examples. For example, if you look to the olfactory system of insects, what these insects do is basically equivalent to a machine learning task which we call multivariate data analysis. So an insect can distinguish different flower types, but it doesn't do so by having special circuits that are tuned to detect roses or tulips, but it has chemical sensors. And there are chemical sensors, and the combination of inputs from the chemical sensors, they then lead to the decision, the association with the combination with a certain flower type. So this is a typical task that people do for multivariate data analysis. It's basically what you do if you show your passport to an electronic passport reader at the airport. You see, you put this thing on the passport reader, the thing looks at your face and then measures all the distances in between the eyes and the ear and the mouth and the nose, which is a large amount of information, like the chemical sensors for the insects. And then what the scanner does by machine learning methods, it combines all these things to take a decision on that is you, or that's a certain flower type. And nature has solved, this is just one example, the task of multivariate data analysis by a very interesting circuitry based on spiking neurons. There are so-called decorrelation units, there are association units, and there is a connection between the two. And if you just reverse engineer the biological circuits, you find that this is a very efficient way, energy and timing and learning efficient way to do multivariate data classification. So there are these concepts that you find in biology that can be transferred to general computing applications.
And I think what our questioner was also asking was for something that's very complex, like an entire field, like economics or something. Can you you're working very much at the building blocks of this idea now. Is it just going to be a matter of building on what you know and putting things together so that your neuromorphic systems can do something as complex as economic theory?
Often the task in economics applications, for example, is to find if something goes wrong, to find surprises. I mean, you have a business which somehow sells things and the things just never change, and then something dramatic happens, that somehow a certain object is not being sold anymore. So this is surprise detection, novelty detection. And there are circuits that are really, again, derived from cortical circuits that are tuned to do novelty detection. There is a group of Jeff Hawkins in the US. He has a company, Numenta, and they developed a system called hierarchical temporal memory, which is very hierarchical temporal memory, which is very biology related, and it can detect novelties in data streams.
So you're going to build a neuromorphic system that can predict the next financial meltdown?
It can, I mean, there
With
is
the
this,
same level of success as any human
There is this
has.
nice application which Jeff always shows. He has a GPS sensor on his bicycle, and he goes to work every day by bicycle. And the sensor has recorded the path for a couple of weeks or so. And it's interesting that this is not, as we say, labeled data. This is just raw data. So the system doesn't know that this is longitude, latitude, and time. It's just a bit string, okay? And then he diverts from the normal path. And the system detects it. He says something is wrong. It's not like what I've used to see. There are other applications where he predicted the taxi demand in New York, which has a very complicated structure. I mean, there are differences between weekdays and Sundays and structure within the day and many complicated things, timing structures, and the system detects them and it immediately sees if something changes, if something is different from the weeks before. To me, that is a very, very cool application, actually.
That's our second lot of career advice tonight. Don't go into economics. Stick with that physics degree, and you should have a better outlook. We've got, yes, another question?
Professor Koch briefly mentioned optogenetics regarding delivering direct input into neurons. What kind of progress has been made as far as BCIs regarding delivering input to a brain?
So far, all the BCIs...
What's a BCI, sorry?
Brain-computer interface, or BMI, brain-machine interfaces. So far, all the existing brain-machine interfaces in people, they're all in patients, all of them use electrical current. They use microelectrodes or macroelectrodes to record. So far, optogenetics, because it requires proteins that come from bacteria, have not been used in humans. They've been used in primates, primarily in rodents, somewhat in primates, but not at all in humans. And that's a problem. So far, people now, Elon Musk, as you heard, has this other startup venture. I think that's about as realistic as his belief that we're going to colonize Mars very soon. Because the problem is the following. The problem, talking to the brain, our brain is protected for very good reason by a skull. The skull is very thick, and the neurons are very small. And the trouble is, in this tiny grain of rice, this tiny cubic millimeter I picked up earlier, there are 100,000 cells, and they're all highly diverse. And in order to induce a specific memory or to get a specific thought or motor pattern, you have to stimulate those neurons, but not the other 95 neurons. And you have to do that from outside the skull, because normal people will not go through the rigors of brain surgery. A neurosurgeon won't do it because there's always a finite risk that you have a stroke or bleeding, etc., which can be lethal. So far, all these brain-machine interfaces are done to restore in severely disabled patients, to restore some of the lost function. It'll be a long time before we'll have techniques where we can do it non-invasively to augment, because, wouldn't it be cool if you and I could have augmented memory? I mean, that would be freaking awesome. But that's not going to happen very soon, unfortunately, because we don't right now have techniques that can pinpoint from the outside non-invasively individual neurons, which is too bad. But
Fantastic. Next question, please.
Hi, thanks very much
and
for that.
If you can stand up so we can see you, thanks.
It's Jules, thanks for the fascinating talk. A slightly different question. I'm just wondering, in addition to Seattle and presumably Heidelberg, what the leading sort of 5 or 6 cities are around the world doing the most cutting-edge research in both neuroscience and deep learning.
And just
and following on with that, if there's any just sort of distinguishing research characteristics between each of those centres.
Wait, so you're asking, I guess we can each give an answer for deep machine learning on the one hand and neuroscience on the other. Well, I mean, so you can hear this big sucking sound. Can you hear it? That's the sound of university department in computer science being all their faculty and major grad students being sucked up by the likes of Google, DeepMind. I mean, DeepMind alone has half of all the theorists in machine learning. DeepMind, Baidu, Apple, Facebook, right? They're all being paid, $250,000, etc. salaries, starting salaries. So that's where most of that research now is happening, and in a bunch of smaller. Neuroscience is worldwide. Literally, as I said, there's 60,000 neuroscientists. So neuroscience is very widely distributed. A lot of it is happening here in Australia. Lots of it on the coast, in the east and west coast of America. Lots of it in Europe. So that's happening everywhere. But we're in this unique place because it's so exciting, because it's so hot, particularly deep convolutional learning, that there's this massive efflux from academia into companies.
But in a way, there's also very good news for universities, because you see, there are other fields like particle physics or astrophysics where clearly the experimental research centers are focused to one place in the world or two places in the world, because it's very expensive and you have to build those machines at one location, and then you have to travel there as a scientist. Both in novel computing architectures and neuroscience, it is a very distributed activity. But what it clearly needs is a coordination. I mean, so far, at least that's my impression as a newcomer in the field, many things were maybe done twice, 3 times, maybe 10 times in the world without really coordinating. So what is extremely important is that the huge amount of resources that are invested in these fields are coordinated and that people know what others do. And that is the purpose of the brain initiatives that are now coming up, and which I think for that purpose are important. They will not build central machines somewhere, but they will hopefully coordinate the work, allow us, for example, to reuse data, to have good description of experiments so that we don't have to repeat things that have already been done. Coordination, I think, is the key to success in the field.
We've only got time for another couple of questions, so I'll take this one from Twitter, which Karlheinz, the intense computational and power requirements that you mentioned, does that mean that the AI takeover is rather unlikely?
The what?
The artificial intelligence takeover.
Well, I mean, artificial intelligence initially has nothing to do with neuromorphic computing. You can build artificial intelligence machines by using conventional computer to solve certain problems. Like, I mean, the Go computer is not that special. There are other things like self-driving cars, like doing text declarations. All that I would call artificial intelligence, and is mostly based on conventional computer. And this thing will go on. And you all feel that. I mean, just give you one example. Have you booked a hotel recently? Did you really take the decision yourself? I don't think so. You are probably registered with some of the portals that offer hotels for you. They make you a good offer, and you usually accept that. So there is artificial intelligence behind that, and that is spreading like wildfire. I mean, many of our decisions are being taken by artificial systems now.
The AI takeover is
that
here.
Is the AI takeover is happening at this very moment. The neuromorphic systems especially are interesting because they allow to do local things. I mean, we are now very much relying on these huge server farms which sit somewhere in the desert of Arizona, I don't know where, consuming huge amounts of energy. To have local intelligence in the systems, like the cell phones, the Internet of Things, the cars, or whatever, that's, I think, is a big hope for neuromorphic computing.
But I mean, regarding power, so yes, it takes a lot of power to learn, but once you've learned something, you can implement in a little chip. You may have seen last week, it made the news, that a little startup company started out of a Hebrew University in Israel by Amnon Shashua called Mobileye, was sold for $15 billion to Intel. They make these very impressive systems, a little chip that you can put behind the mirror that allows your car to drive completely autonomous by itself. They're in production now. And so here, yes, it took 100,000 of hours and label data and to do the deep machine learning to learn it. But then you can download it and replicate it at very cheap cost and put it in every single car. And that's, of course, what's going to happen. So the expensive part is learning. Once you've learned it, it's very quick. It's real time.
I fully agree. But there's also an interesting development. Our own brains, we don't go through a learning phase and a use phase. This is what you do with most of the synthetic systems now. What we do, we do continuous learning. We just update our knowledge continuously. And I think it's very important that we build systems that do continuous learning, which is not based on hundreds of millions of labeled data sets. To do continuous learning from the experience we have every day, I think is a very important thing. And there's a big program in the US now coming up that is supporting exactly that kind of approach, which I think is very important.
Our next question.
Thank you very much for the talk. And your last answer led on exactly to my question, which is the nature of how the neuromorphic computing might work. And I wonder if we're not limited by the hardware in that, as you say, we have continuous learning and particularly axonal connections are continually pruned and redone, and it makes the whole firing of any neuron probabilistic in its total function. So when you use a neuromorphic computing, do you think you're limited by the hardware because you're not able to continually change the connections between the processes, even if the processes do act in an appropriate way to mirror a neuron?
Yeah, I mean, actually we can change connections. We do that all the time. We have what we call structural plasticity. We can grow connections and we can destroy connections, which sounds weird. I mean, how can you destroy and grow connections on silicon? Well, of course, the connections are there, but they are not used. We can just switch them on and can switch them off. So that's possible. But clearly, the technology we use at the moment is what is called CMOS electronics. That's a type of electronics that has been developed to build conventional microprocessors, and we are kind of misusing it now to do this new computing architecture. We all hope that in the future there will be the new devices coming up, like nano devices, for example, that are more suited for neuromorphic computing. But for the time being, we have to use what is there. And for me, it's very important that we demonstrate that these kind of architectures work. Once we have shown that convincingly, I'm sure we can use nano devices, which are now in the labs at many of the big industry players, to build neuromorphic systems with non-CMOS devices.
Okay, only because Rachel's just pointed at you, we have time for one last question. We really are right at the end.
Hi, thank you for the very nice talk. I just wanted to ask if there's any limitation at the moment with the understanding of how the brain works in terms of the physics of how it operates? Or do we have a complete understanding of it and then it's just a matter of understanding how the configuration works with each other, or the components works with each other?
You mean, are there fundamental new laws of physics that are at operation in the brain that we haven't understood yet?
Yes, yes.
Well, so people are forever postulating that sort of large-scale quantum mechanical effects are important. Roger Penrose has made this argument for the longest. Right now, there isn't too much empirical evidence that the brain uses such sort of quantum computers, right? You've heard of quantum computers, and the question that's been raised, is the brain a quantum computer? Right now, there isn't really too much evidence for that. You can never rule it out, but most of the assumption is that that the brain is a classical system that can be treated by classical physics, with the exception of things where physics meets the biology, like at the photoreceptor level, there's some quantum mechanic tunneling involved, and where the air molecules meet our cochlear sensors, there might also be quantum mechanical effects involved. But then when you're talking about the brain proper, that most of that processing involves conventional classical physics, because after all, the brain is it's a very warm, it's a wet and a warm system by physical criteria. Quantum computers have to be isolated either in the ultra cold or in the vacuum to prevent them from stop working. So it's unlikely that the brain is a quantum computer, but it cannot be ruled out.
There's actually an interesting development which goes in the other direction. It could be that quantum mechanics really at the end is a classical theory. And there are some recent papers there's a guy from Microsoft actually, Matthias Treuer, who's a professor in Zurich, who has shown that there is an equivalence between neural networks and multi-particle quantum systems, classical neural networks and multi-particle quantum systems. There's a science paper which came out, I think, 2 weeks ago. Very, very impressive. Highly recommended reading for those who are interested in those connections.
Has he roped gravity into quantum theory?
No. It's actually a rather simple idea, but I find it means that all the correlations you see in the quantum system, which are produced by so-called entanglement, you can track that by a neural network. A quick, completely equivalent description, which I find quite amazing.
A classical neural network.
A classical neural network, right, like the ones we have in our systems.
We have absolutely run out of time here, but please join me in thanking our speakers from the left, Professors Gary Egan, Karlheinz Meier and Christof Koch. And I do just, before you go anywhere, this real problem of how consciousness works and what's going on there. Let's hope with these highly organised 60,000 odd neuroscientists and colleagues that we get somewhere with that. None of us are getting closer to the beginning of our careers. Before you reach the absolute end of your careers, what would you... I'm hoping this wasn't the death of your career coming here tonight. What in your field, in your work, do you want to see before you finish working on it?
I've said this and I've written about it. I want to understand consciousness, at least how it arises out of the physical world before I die. That's my stated professional aim.
How old are you now, Christof?
That's not relevant.
I think he sees some enhancement helping along there. And Karlheinz, what would you like?
A very moderate thing. I would like to see a continuous learning system operational that does not have this artificial separation between learning, training and use, but that just keeps collecting information and makes use of it like we humans do.
And how old are you? Just curious.
Look at the web. It's not a secret.
And how old are you?
52, yep. I've got much simpler aspirations, retire to the beach. Gary, can I just get you to answer that as well on behalf of the Australian Brain Alliance or the Centre for Integrative Brain Function?
Yes, well, look, we're absolutely aspiring towards understanding all of the inner parts of the brain and how they link out into our behaviour. And one of the key parts of doing that is to be able to image. We saw quite a bit of interesting imaging this evening, and doing that in humans, of course, is the real ultimate challenge. That's one of the challenges that I've got personally. Yeah. Thank you, Bernie. Well, look, I just wanted to finish up by letting you all know that this is one of the public outreach activities and the knowledge sharing activities of the Centre of Excellence, and it's particularly led from the Brain Dialogue, which you can find on the internet. If you go onto cibf.edu.au, you'll see a huge amount of information there about the research that the Centre of Excellence is doing. It's interpreted for you in a very accessible manner, and it's actually even then communicated personally to you in a number of events that the Brain Dialogue and the Centre of Excellence is running. This has been our feature event for 2017, but we'll be having other events throughout the year, and in fact next month on the 3rd of May you'd be able to come along to an event, Machines That Read Your Mind. So you'd be very welcome to register for that. It's at the Deakin Edge. It's part of the Melbourne Knowledge Week events. In fact, it's one of the landmark events at the end of that week on the Friday afternoon. Get down there on the 3rd of... It's actually not Friday, it's Wednesday. Ah, okay. I thought it was Friday.
They're not afraid of going out on a school night. Look at them.
But you'd be extremely welcome to come along to that and join in with the further discussion around the brain, understanding neuromorphic computing, and so many other exciting and interesting areas. So please join with me once more to very much thank our speakers this evening and Bernie Hobbs for hosting our event.